Today, we're on a masonry job site where the subject is mortar. And when a mason contractor is awarded a project, whether it's a brick, block, or stone job, one of their first decisions is how they're going to make the mortar. One option is traditional field mixed mortar batched on site, shoveling sand from a pile and then manually lifting and breaking bags of cement into the mixer, or the option of SPEC mix factory pre-blended, where all the ingredients are pre-measured and blended, so all you need to do is just add water to the SPEC mix material in the mixer. Typically, the most common reasons why contractors across North America choose SPEC mix over the field mix mortar is consistency and quality control, especially colored mortar, where every batch must be exactly the same. For some contractors, it's a matter of peace of mind knowing that SPEC mix is made to meet ASTM specifications and is pre-tested, which is all validated by laboratory test reports and backed by a complete submittal package provided by your SPEC mix representative, all referred to as technical support, something that doesn't come with field mixed mortar. But there's another key factor that doesn't get as much attention as it should, and it's yield per batch of mortar. Whether the project calls for 500 block or 500,000 brick, mortar yield equals cost and profitability. Today, we're going to make batches of mortar to determine yield and ultimately cost of mortar by way of field mixing the materials compared to SPEC mix. Now, there's definitely obvious differences and ultimately advantages for contractors. So let's take a close technical look at the yield of the two mortars.
First things first, we made a small batch of material to coat the inside of the mixer. Then, made sure the mixer is completely empty. This is to make certain we're starting with a level playing field. We'll start by making a single batch of field mixed mortar consisting of one 75-pound bag of masonry cement and 18 shovels of damp sand, which is a typical batch of mortar that meets the ASTM C270 proportion specification. All right, to begin, we added 2/3 of the mixing water, so about 4 to 5 gallons. Then, we added 9 shovels of mason sand, or half of the 18 shovels required, which equaled 1 1/4 cubic feet of sand. Note that it takes approximately 7 shovels of sand to fill 1 cubic foot box. Next, we added the 75-pound bag of masonry cement. Because we're keeping track of the total amount of materials going into each batch of mortar, we measured the bag of cement and it equaled 1 cubic feet by volume. So, 1 cubic feet of cement was added to the mixer. We added the remaining 9 shovels of sand, or another 1 1/4 cubic feet, to the mixer, resulting in 18 total shovels of sand in the batch for a final total of 2.5 cubic feet of sand. Then, more water was added as necessary to adjust the mortar's consistency for the job. Okay, so when all was said and done, the batch of field mixed mortar included 2.5 cubic feet of sand plus 1 cubic foot of masonry cement for a grand total of 3.5 cubic feet of materials. Now let's determine how many cubic feet of wet mortar will 3.5 cubic feet of sand and cement produce, or yield. To be exact, we dumped all the wet mortar into a wheelbarrow until the mixer was completely empty. The next step is to shovel all the mortar into the cubic foot box until the wheelbarrow was completely empty. When we were finished, the batch of field mixed mortar only produced 2 1/8 cubic feet of wet mortar. Let's apply this to a job site situation. If a mason can lay 18 8-inch regular block per cubic feet of mortar, then our batch of Type S field mix mortar will provide enough material to lay 38 to 40 block. And I want you to remember those numbers. Remember, a total of 3.5 cubic feet of mortar materials were added to the mixer. Do the math, and that's a 40% decrease in volume, or 1 1/3 less cubic feet of wet mortar than the 3.5 cubic feet of mortar materials added to the mixer. And this proves that when a yard of sand, or 27 cubic feet, is dumped on a job site and mixed with the appropriate amount of bagged masonry cement to make mortar, it's physically impossible for it to produce 27 cubic feet of mortar. The best case scenario is 20, maybe 22 cubic feet of wet mortar. Next, we made a batch of SPEC mix masonry cement and sand mortar by putting the same amount of dry material into the mixer, 3.5 cubic feet, to determine its yield. We started by adding 2/3 of the mixing water to the mixer, about 8 to 10 gallons. Then our laborer began by emptying 80-pound bags of SPEC mix pre-blended mortar into a cubic foot box until it was full. Each box was dispensed into the mixer and carefully counted until a total of 3.5 cubic feet of dry SPEC mix mortar was added to the mixer. Note that it took 4.5 80-pound bags of SPEC mix to equal 3.5 cubic feet of material. Once again, we let the batch mix for 4 to 5 minutes until the consistency of the material matched that of the field mixed mortar. We then dispensed all the material from the mixer into the wheelbarrow until the mixer was completely empty. Just like the batch of field mix, we filled the cubic foot box as many times as needed until the wheelbarrow was empty to get a final count on the number of cubic foot produced from 3.5 cubic feet of SPEC mix material. The outcome? 3 3/8 cubic feet of wet mortar. When you multiply 3 3/8 cubic feet times 18 8-inch regular CMU, the batch of SPEC mix produces enough mortar for a mason to lay 60 block, which is 20 more block than the batch of field mix mortar made earlier. To summarize, after adding 3.5 cubic feet of SPEC mix mortar to the mixer, SPEC mix yielded 3 3/8 cubic feet. That's more than 1 1/4 cubic feet more mortar than the same volume of field batched mortar materials, which adds up to 35% more mortar to get the job done.
Over the course of a project and making hundreds, if not thousands of batches of mortar, that leads to massive savings. So again, whether your project requires brick, block, or stone, choosing SPEC mix pre-blended mortar over field mix mortar, you get at least 25% more mortar, and that saves you at least 25% less in materials, plus as much as 40% in labor costs, especially by using a SPEC mix silo system that eliminates the time wasted on shoveling sand and breaking bags into the mixer. Apply these advantages and savings over a year's time, and the decrease in cost, coupled with the assurance that the quality, consistency, and efficiency of your mortar saves you money day in and day out, well, it proves that SPEC mix is the solution for higher productivity and profitability on every job.